Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It's a pleasure to welcome back to the program Manisha Sinha. She is chair of American history at the University of Connecticut, author of The Rise and Fall of the Second American Republic, Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920. Professor, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam.
So let's start with this, which is, I think, like in terms of your work here, the maybe the most sort of obvious question: Reconstruction, 1860 to 1920. A lot of people who talk about Reconstruction, like this starts after the war, 1865, 1866, 67, and then goes. There's some dispute, like is it 12 years, is it 15 years? But you refer to this whole era as Reconstruction. Let's just start broadly, why?
Yes, that's a great question. The traditional understanding of Reconstruction, which is the period immediately following the Civil War, as you said, it starts in 1865 when the war ends, and usually the period goes up to 1877 when the last Reconstruction state governments fall in the South. There's a so-called Compromise of 1877, which some historians dispute now. And that's the traditional chronology. And so Reconstruction doesn't make much of an impact on people looking at American history. It just sort of seems to last a very short while, and then it's gone. And I thought in order to really understand the pivotal role of Reconstruction in U.S. history in shaping our present-day political traditions and understanding some of the issues that we still live with, that we had to look at the start of the war. Or even with the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860, when the first Southern states leave the Union. And really, I extended the timeline right up to the end of the 19th century, because Reconstruction doesn't really get over until you have in place the disfranchisement of Black men in the South and the Jim Crow system, which is green-lighted by the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So my book pays a lot of attention to what I call the unwinding of Reconstruction between 1877 and 1900, and then looks forward a bit to the 19th Amendment in 1920 that gave women the right to vote. I call that the last Reconstruction Amendment.
It does, following your work here, it really does sort of feel like we need another word, we need another era. I know, part of it is referred to as the Gilded Age, but there is, the counter Reconstruction, the deconstruction or whatever, because it really does. So much of that is important in acknowledging and telling the story of Reconstruction, because maybe, just so that everybody's on the same page here, you can tell people just the history of our understanding of Reconstruction, the Dunning School, the sort of revisionist era, and because we don't have a name for the sort of unwinding of Reconstruction, because to a large extent, the story of Reconstruction was obscured in many ways, in part by that unwinding.
Absolutely. That's just a great point that you're making there. If we look at the ways in which at least academic historians wrote about Reconstruction, you mentioned the Dunning School at Columbia University, my alma mater, and many of his students, they were really interested in trying to show that Reconstruction was a big failure, and that giving citizenship rights to Black people immediately on emancipation was a huge mistake. And that view of Reconstruction as this awful period of Black misrule and political corruption really went hand in hand with lost cause mythologies of the Civil War. It's only outside academia that you had somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois, a Black activist and scholar, intellectual, who wrote the first comprehensive history of Reconstruction that challenged this view in the 1930s. And his sort of timeline was also expanded a bit, like mine. He also looked at the 1880s because he was interested in looking at exactly how Reconstruction was overthrown through a combination of domestic racial terrorism in the South, but also the ways in which the Supreme Court gutted federal civil rights laws and the Reconstruction era constitutional amendments. And then we had historians who sort of went back to the traditional timeline. My own mentor, Eric Foner, who wrote the book on Reconstruction in the 1980s, went back a bit further. He went back to the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, but he also ended in 1877. And I guess my book is a bit of a sequel to his book because I really did want to look at this period after 1877 because a lot happens then. There are still experiments in interracial state governments in the South, in North Carolina, in Tennessee, and Virginia in the 1890s. There is still a lot happening in this period. And as you mentioned, we look at this period normally as the Gilded Age. But the takeoff of industrial capitalism in the North is really connected to the fall of Reconstruction and to the North's sort of giving up on this project of interracial democracy in the South.
And I should say, I think for a lot of people, there's an awareness of this, but I think it's always important to remind everybody, when you say domestic racial terrorism, it's not a metaphorical, that's not, we're talking literally pogroms, violence attacking black politicians, black middle class, whether we're talking like Wilmington or Atlanta, Oklahoma, I think people are aware of, but there are multiple examples of this, ranging from like how many people were killed, how many people were threatened, firebombed, whatnot, driven out of office, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so let's get into sort of those things that lay the groundwork for Reconstruction, and then into the era that where you suggest it is not like that there is a tension within the Republican Party, in which, remind people, it was the radical Republicans, but they lost their power in this. So there wasn't a sense that the Republicans saw that, Reconstruction as they had planned it as a function of these emancipatory amendments to the Constitution were failures, and they had decided to turn course. It was that the sort of counter-revolutionary forces, if you want to say, simply gained more strength, and in part because of what you were saying was happening with the Northern industrialists.
Absolutely. That's just such an excellent point. The notion that somehow the radicals or the abolitionists, who the radical Republicans were closely associated with, simply gave up on this emancipatory project is simply untrue. The fact is that their opponents outlasted them. In the South, as you mentioned, there is a full-scale campaign, and I should say domestic racist terrorism with, sort of paramilitary forces like the Ku Klux Klan, the First Klan, the White Liners, White Brotherhood, the Red Shirts in South Carolina. And this was targeted political violence against freed people, but also against white Republicans and office holders in the South. So there's this huge campaign of terror that they've undertaken. And within the Republican Party in the North, there's an increasing feeling, especially in the second term of Ulysses Grant's administration, that the North should, and the Republican Party should simply withdraw from the South now, that this was getting too much. There was just sort of fatigue about this. People were far more interested in economic problems in the North with the Great Recession of 1873 and then the railroad strikes in 1877. But what you hinted at in your question, which is, I think, so important, is that the Republican Party is transformed from the party of Lincoln and anti-slavery and black rights during the Reconstruction era to increasingly a party that is far more concerned with putting down strikes in the North, and starts listening to Southern political elites who are complaining about the interference, so-called interference of the federal government in Southern local affairs. And this group of Republicans, they were called the liberal Republicans, liberal not as you and I understand it today, modern liberalism, but as classical laissez-faire liberals who believe that government should simply not interfere in society or in economics at all. So no regulation of working hours or minimum wage in the North, but also that meant doing away from a commitment to Reconstruction in the South. And these liberal Republicans, they challenged Grant in the 1872 elections, and they join up with Democrats, which at that time, of course, was the party of the South and white supremacy, and they lose. But by 1877, they actually capture the Republican Party. And their capture of the Republican Party is exactly what results in this party of Lincoln and anti-slavery becoming increasingly the party of big business during the Gilded Age, and also eventually the party of imperialism.
And there's a it's appropriate for me to bring this up here because there's like a mirror image in my mind that comes up as you make the argument that this expansionism and imperialism and industrialism both almost like transfers the energy that was going into Reconstruction into a project to essentially commit genocide and expand westward, and then also because that energy is also used to expand in terms of like our hemisphere. Seems to me to be almost like a mirror image of what the Trail of Tears and the expulsion of indigenous people around Georgia and whatnot, how that the energy to expel indigenous folks in Georgia and push them on to the Trail of Tears was really just a way to make the land available to bring in slavery and work it for cotton. And sort of like then almost that energy like happens in another way on the other end of this sort of emancipatory project, both the Civil War and Reconstruction. Talk about that, but I just also want to mention before we get out of that era of Reconstruction, 600, I didn't realize 600 schools were established by freed people. And it gives you a notion of why there is, because ultimately we're going to tie this back to this era, but attacking public schools is so rooted in what their first sort of like mission was as a broad project, which is create citizens from people who have been exploited and empower them. And we see that attacks on public education today, I think for the same reasons we did 150 years ago. But talk about that second wave, like that battle within the Republican Party is won by the sort of more imperialistic and industrial. Where do they start to channel this energy? Because this is like almost like a bipartisanship at this point.
Absolutely. And again, two great points that you made there. One, of course, the American Republic was founded on native dispossession. And the worst instances were, as you mentioned, in the antebellum era of the Trail of Tears, in the 1850s, genocidal warfare against indigenous nations in Oregon, in California. And many Southern slaveholders had this vision of a pro-slavery empire in the West that would be based on Indian dispossession and Black enslavement. They were quite clear about that. There was a southern form of imperialism. They even invaded illegally some of our neighboring states and countries. So it's quite clear that that this process was ongoing. That's why the Civil War and Reconstruction, I argue, present a real course correction in American history, because suddenly the federal government is moving federal troops out of the West and to the South to fight this Civil War and eventually to liberate Black people once emancipation becomes the formal stated goal of the Union Army. And all through Reconstruction, federal troops are deployed in the South, even though towards the end of the period, they're increasingly being taken out. But once the commitment to Reconstruction is completely over, what do? They restation exactly the same troops into the West to conduct these wars of imperialism, really. And I recognize them as such. There are a lot of American historians who see the Indian Wars, better called wars against Indians, as simply a continuation of the Civil War. And I argued, no, this is a completely different political project. And it cannot be equated to the Civil War. And in fact, it is the defeat of the emancipatory project of the Civil War and Reconstruction that eventually leads to the conquest of the West and the elimination of the last indigenous sovereignties there. And from then, it's a springboard to the Spanish-American-Cuban War, the colonization of Philippines, informal empire in Cuba, the acquisition of Hawaii and Puerto Rico. You really get the rise of a formal American empire. The United States joins the scramble for empire. But the other point that you made, which I think is so important, is the idea that during Reconstruction, there's a real commitment in the South to establish the public school system. A lot of Americans don't know this, but the public school system that emerged in New England and was common in the North before the Civil War as an important facet of democratic citizenship, right? You make available education to all American citizens was not there in the South, where elites could access private education.
And to be clear, for white or Black?
Well, for Black people, extremely difficult, even in the North, to get access to education.
I'm saying in the South.
In the South, yeah. In the South, yeah. Southern whites, if you were poor, you did not have access. Absolutely. Yeah, sorry, I misunderstood. So in terms of the kind of educational system available in the South, you didn't have a widespread public school system as you did in the North. And the Reconstruction state governments, one of the first things they do is they tax elites in order to build up a public school system, asylums, orphanages, all the kinds of services that were available in the North, but not so widespread in the South. And then that's when elites start attacking the public school system, Southern white elites, and they start forming taxpayers' conventions saying, we don't want to be taxed for public schools. So this attack on public education is something that is old. And it emerges during Reconstruction. You can still see it as very much a formative sort of agenda of political conservatism today, that education should be widely and freely available to American citizens. And this is also the time when you have the formation of the historically Black universities and colleges. And that is extremely important in terms of the development of Black education. You have somebody like Kamala Harris, who got her degree from Harvard University, which began as, an HBCU during the Reconstruction era. And there were hundreds of them in the South, freedmen schools. The first one established where the Union first established a stronghold during the Civil War at Hampton, which eventually became Hampton University. So this was one of the huge achievements of Reconstruction that we normally don't talk about, and that is the emergence of the public school system in the South and the emergence of historically Black colleges and universities.
Well, I guess this is a two-part question. Was the assault, the sort of like the counter-revolutionary impetus to attack the public schools, because they were able to close a lot of those schools, was that how much of that was pure racially motivated versus class motivated? Because we see this also in the restrictions on voting in the South, that we're just as happy to dispossess poor white votes as we are any black votes, essentially, because neither one of them is our constituency. So that's the first part of the question. And does HBCUs, do they survive because on some level there's a sense of like, well, who's going to get there if we undermine, K through 12? We don't have to worry about the sort of like political threat associated with the small, and I guess presumably from their perspective, sort of an upper class of black people, a more sort of like economically elite black population, because they'll be small enough that, and maybe our interests will be slightly more aligned, that they won't be as much of a political threat.
Yes. So again, two excellent questions right there. There's this debate in Southern history, the race versus class debate. And I wrote about this in my first book, which was a book on Southern political history. This notion that somehow that there was sort of white liberty based on black slavery, so all whites were sort of equal and free together. And this is such a wrong way of looking at Southern history, because we know slaveholding planters in particularly aggrandized economic and political power in the antebellum South at the cost, particularly, of course, of the enslaved, but also of poor whites and white farmers in the South. So this notion that somehow a race trumped class and that class did not matter in the South is incorrect. I mean, these people were conservative at all levels. They were racist. They tended to be misogynists too. They were very much against the abolitionist movement because they saw it as a threat in terms of arguing for women's rights. And they were also elitists. They were classists. They had malapportioned state legislatures that overrepresented slaveholding counties. Pretty much what the 3/5 clause did for them at the federal level. They were overrepresented and they aggrandized political power. And this was a constant debate in the South. So after Reconstruction, when you have all these disfranchisement plans that are put into place, whether they're poll taxes, literacy clauses, yes, they end up disfranchising a lot of Southern whites. And once Black people are locked into this sharecropping system and Reconstruction is overthrown and they enter these sort of debt peonage relationships with planters and merchants, that happens to Southern poor whites too, many of whom also fall under the trap of disfranchisement. And some of them more particularly, lose their farms, become tenants and sharecroppers. So the fall of Reconstruction has an adverse impact on democracy as a whole and on Southern society as a whole. And there is this sort of provincial elite in the South that does this. And they are quite tolerant of the HBCUs, maybe because they're not racially integrated. One of the main things that they were worried about with the public school system was to, in fact, segregate these schools according to race. And once you have the rise of the populist movement in the 1890s, that posed a bit of a challenge to these democratic elites in the South. And at that time, of course, remember the Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy and states' rights and racial illiberalism. They go about disfranchising poor whites thoroughly also. For African Americans, there were various strategies on how to survive the fall of Reconstruction. And Booker T. Washington, who emerges as the sort of foremost accommodationist to this new segregationist regime, makes an argument that maybe Black education should not be so much in liberal arts or fighting for political and civil rights, that it should be really a vocational education so that Black people can fit a certain position in the Southern economy. And his Tuskegee Institute in Alabama does that. So there is a real attempt to limit Black education. The HBCUs, though, survive mainly because of Northern white philanthropy, and Booker T. Washington is, he has a machine where he also gets a lot of money, and even though he puts up an accommodationist face, on the sidelines, he is financing campaigns against lynching and racial violence in the South also. So he's a complicated figure, but somehow Black education outlasts this attempt to destroy it. We know that during Reconstruction, Black schools and churches are targeted and they're burned to the ground. I mean, that burning Black schools and churches continues right down to the Civil Rights era and beyond. So this attack on it continues, but it does outlast it. And one of the achievements of freedom is to see the literacy rate amongst the Black population grow up dramatically in the post-Civil War period, even in the post-war South. And even land ownership, which had been sort of done away with by Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln to the presidency, he gave back all the land that had been redistributed to freed people back to the planters. Even land ownership ticks up slowly but steadily until the end of the 19th century. So all this in the most dismal circumstances. So if there had been a level playing field, if in fact Black people had access equally to education and to land ownership, the progress would have been much more.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.